Today is a kind of continuation of some of last week. We were starting with the Post-Impressionists last week, and we looked at Van Gogh, and we looked at the work of Munch. And remember, they represent one small part of a three-category large unity in the visual arts. Those two artists represent what we call expressionism, which is the immediate expression of strong feeling. So typically expressionists use very strong color contrast, very strong value contrast, very complex shape arrangements, and the work has a kind of tense energy about it. Of all the techniques at the time, Expressionism was the sloppiest. And the reason it was the sloppiest, it most rejects the Renaissance and Baroque realistic ideal. The reason it rejects that is they take way too long. And the whole idea behind Expressionism is to express an immediate feeling. And those techniques take way too long, take much too much planning, and the emotional intensity gets dissipated through all of that organization and planning. So there are techniques that certain kinds of personalities get attracted to, and but it's only one category in the visual arts. And today, we're going to start looking at a couple other categories that are just as important. Now, let me say a little more in review about the context in which the art we're going to look at today. Remember, we've now got the development of the gallery system. Gallery systems only typically work in major art centers. And of course, Paris at this time is probably the art center in the world. Munich takes a kind of sorry second place. New York doesn't show up at all in the major art centers this early on. But in any case, if you have an art center, then you start to get series of galleries. And remember what the gallery does. It separates the buyer from the maker. So the maker does not think about the buyer's interests or wishes. The maker thinks about themselves. Pretty much one theme that I think you can talk more and more about as we go along here is one pervasive theme that runs through all of modern art is the notion of self-expression, self with a capital S. And that basically means just about every work of art that most modern artists make, no matter what its subject matter is a self-portrait. It's meant to represent the personality of the artist, not the personality of the buyer or any patron, but it's simply an idea that generates in the head and the heart of the artist, and the artist hopes someone comes along the street and has a resonance with what they're doing and buys a work of art. And what happens, of course, is this whole kind of connection needs stimulus. So what that means is not only do you get galleries, but you start to get art journals. You start to get advertisement. This art needs to be presented to the public in a way they can start to understand it, and in understanding it, start to buy it. This is the modern world. Our modern gallery world is established in this particular era, and the modern art world is pretty much working this way even today. Now, if you look at that sheet that we gave you, I mentioned a couple events here that are going to be shaping the art we look at today. One of them is the Einstein's theory of relativity. We've already talked a little bit about Darwinism and how Darwinism shaped the modern sensibility. Einstein's theory, very few people fully understand what E equals mc squared. Everyone knows the formula, but almost no one really fully understands the complex mathematics behind that formula. But the implications of that formula is the same thing as Darwinism. With Darwinism, the idea of animal categories starts to blur. Identity of animals change over time. Even species switch over and change over time. With Einstein's notion, time and space all get interconnected. Everything is connected with everything else. Everything's dependent on everything else. And the borders get lost. The average layperson can't comprehend the difference between the idea of space as a curved phenomenon and the idea of what we call gravity. It takes a while to figure all of that out. And most of us don't have the interest or the ability to do that. But in any case, that becomes a background thing. Artists don't read scientific journals, but artists are very sensitive to the wavelengths of an age. And they reflect those wavelengths even when they don't consciously intend on doing that. So that's a major factor in what we're talking about today. The other major factor is the continual progress of transportation and movement of peoples. I define that in terms of cars and airplanes. I could have included trains in there as well. The average modern person cannot comprehend the fact that the average medieval person never moved more than 10 miles away from where they were born. Most of us have been all over the world. Now, all of that happens because of modern means of mobility. And the idea of rapid change becomes a part of the visual arts and growing out of all the movement in modern life. So basically, art movements nowadays, when I'm talking about them, you can break them down typically in about 10 or 12 year eras. They don't last very long, partly because of this modern means of presentation. Everyone sees a certain kind of art over a certain period of time, and day after day after day, you get immersed in it, and everyone gets, okay, I got it, let's move on. You know, that's basically what happens. There's a kind of modern visual fatigue that happens with current styles. So each style is sort of developed to express a certain kind of thing or solve a certain kind of visual problem. Okay, it's solved. We get it. Okay, let's move on. That's basically the modern art world. And that world is being generated in the work we're going to be looking at today. Let's take a look at the first work here. Gauguin was a friend of Van Gogh. They worked together for a brief amount of time in Arles. Gauguin represents an artist who fits in another category. We call that fantasy. By fantasy, we mean a kind of imaginary world that doesn't follow the rules of the ordinary world. Now, this particular work by Gauguin, he painted when he was painting in New Brittany. And by the way, he was a very successful stockbroker in Paris. And he became a Sunday afternoon painter, and he became so passionate about painting it took over his whole life. Eventually, he left his wife and kids, and of course left his job. He went to New Brittany at first because New Brittany is kind of a primitive area, and he wanted to paint realities that didn't look like everyday Parisian life. He wanted something that just seemed a little different and strange. And this particular painting deals with a biblical subject that actually is a very strange story. I've actually made a sculpture associated with the subject as well. The story, and it shows up in Genesis. Jacob meets this angel, and they get in a wrestling match. It's curious, the way the biblical narrative reads. It's not a boxing match, it's a wrestling match. Wrestling is a very different kind of sport than boxing is. It requires a much more intimate contact. Anyway, this is a seminal story, Old Testament story. Jacob fights with this angel. They're wrestling all night long. And by the way, the words used, the Hebrew words used referring to the angel, become somewhat ambiguous. Is this an angel or is Jacob fighting with God? It's meant to be a mysterious story. Anyway, they're fighting all night long. Finally, the angel dislocates Jacob's hip. And so it looks like he's lost. But Jacob is this very tenacious character, and he said, I will not let you go. I won't let go of you until you give me a blessing. And so the question is, who won that fight? I actually think Jacob won the fight, not the angel, because he wouldn't let the angel leave until he got his blessing. So I made a sculpture called Jacob's Angel, in which the angel is in pain. His hip is messed up, not Jacob's. Any case, this is that biblical story. Gauguin chooses colors, as you notice, especially that red field area where we see Jacob and the angel wrestling, in these odd colors that are not natural colors. And so that takes us out of the normal world of senses. And then these nuns, or these New Brittany women, I'm calling them nuns, but that's the headgear that women in that area wear. This is after a sermon, and so they're in this kind of mystical mood, and they see this vision of the angel and Jacob wrestling. And of course, he represents the angel with wings. Imagine trying to wrestle with wings. That's just a little hard to spatially comprehend. Anyway, you can see how the whole image creates a kind of odd, what's going on here kind of feeling. He's, like all modern artists, he's very, very conscious of composition. So he's actually very thoughtful. He's not an expressionist. He paints slower than Van Gogh does. And he's very, very thoughtful about arrangement and composition. So you get all this clustering of these women in the lower section here, and then the highlight of the angel and Jacob, and it's curious the way he's represented them. Would you see that as two figures? If you count feet, you realize there are two figures there, but they're kind of, where do you see the difference between one and the other? Again, the guy's got serious theological insights. This is really a seminal story in the Old Testament. And he picks this story and he represents it as, is Jacob wrestling with himself, or is he wrestling with God, or is he wrestling with an angel? At this point, it's all merged together in one kind of dark cloud. Okay, can we see the next one, please? Generally, I remind you, look at the bottom of the captioning here. Look at the measurements of works and try to imagine them in the scale that's represented there. You see, this painting is actually bigger than the image we see on the screen. It's got, again, an elaborate title. Where do we come from? Where are we? Where are we going? The painting kind of reads from right to left. I don't have my little red button here, but if you look off to the far right, you see what appears to be a baby, an infant on the ground. And then you see a dog off to the side there. Then as you move along, you see these other figures. By the way, this represents Tahiti. He eventually went to Tahiti. Again, he was looking for a more exotic environment to paint that was totally different than Western Europe. And as you move along, you eventually come to this end of the painting. Again, we have a little animal in the corner, but we have an older woman who is kind of sort of fetal-like in her pose, and she represents the end of life. Yes. Now we have a statue, a religious figure, somewhere through that cycle, and that partly, of course, represents the function of faith and belief as a part of this cycle of life. It's curious, though, he represents the whole cycle. It appears to me, I cannot see a single male figure in the cycle. Maybe there is, maybe this figure that's standing up that breaks the space in half is a male figure. Any case, it represents a kind of religious vision, but it doesn't represent the conventional European religion. And you'll notice again, he uses exotic colors, the kind of colors we'd associate with an exotic environment. And of course, foliage and roots and branches and so on weave throughout the entire composition. Again, it represents a kind of fantasy. I'm trying to make sense out of it, but you can only make more or less intuitive sense out of it. I can't exactly say this represents this and this represents that. It's not meant to be read that way. It's meant to be read as a kind of quiet, soft fantasy impression. But just given the sheer scale of the painting, it obviously required a lot of planning. He's a very, very careful artist when it comes to structure of a composition. Now, can we see the next one? Now, you're going to have to be sympathetic with me when I talk about this artist, because you'll look at a painting like this and you'll say, what's the deal? And this guy is probably one of the most important artists that become a part of the whole context of human history. This is Paul Cézanne. Cézanne understands and recreates pictorial space. He's a formalist. A formalist is an artist who cares about form and composition, and that's the primary concern. So formalists typically paint very slowly. They're very thoughtful about the arrangement of shapes and colors, and they're expressing themselves, but not in the direct, violent, tense way we get with guys like Munch. They're expressing themselves in a much calmer, quieter, more calculating way. It's no accident that he picks subjects like this. Still life subjects become one of the prominent themes in Cézanne's work. Now let me try to help you understand why he becomes such an important guy. Remember, he's painting right in the middle of the Impressionism context. Impressionism eventually became more popular. It was not initially popular. Eventually it became fairly popular. And these three artists we're going to be talking about associated with Post-Impressionism, all of them started out as Impressionists, but then they moved beyond that. And Cézanne said to himself, Impressionism to him seemed kind of superficial. It was about impressions, transitory things, little dabs of paint that sort of flicker across the surface. So Manet could take the iron reality of Saint-Lazare station and turn it into smoke and color. Cézanne was a much more concrete, down-to-earth materialist artist. He said he wanted to make of Impressionism art that was solid and durable, like the art of the museums. By that he meant he wanted to create an art that was based on structural realities and reason. And to do so, he recreated pictorial space. Now, ever since the Renaissance, when Brunelleschi invented the system of linear perspective in Florence, Brunelleschi, by the way, was the architect of the dome of the Duomo in Florence. He was a brilliant mathematician. He was the guy who invented the idea of linear perspective. Linear perspective is a way of representing solid geometric objects as if they recede back in space. But artists had done this sort of thing kind of intuitively. But he was the first guy who came up with the system. Now, I've taught drawing for my entire career. And one of the first things I do when I teach a basic drawing course is teach them 1-point and 2-point linear perspective. Anyway, it's a great way of representing real space in paintings. Well, Cézanne realized that there's something limited about this thing. Here, Western art has been using the system for several hundred years now, and there's something limiting about it. It's unnatural. When he watched kids draw and uneducated, artistically uneducated adults draw, they didn't draw in linear perspective. And one of the things he noticed about that is linear perspective demands a single static observer. It's normal for people to move. And perspective says, no, don't move. I couldn't even let the students shift their eyes around the room. They had to keep that one fixed vantage point. Cézanne says that that's natural. That's not natural. Children draw in a natural way. If they draw a house, the reason their houses look kind of flat is they draw the front the way it looks if you stood in front of the house, and then they draw the side exactly the way it looked if you stood and looked at the side of the house. And of course, you can't be in two places at once. But the idea is it's a composite view. It creates a conception of motion related to the object. It's a moving observer, no longer a fixed observer. So now let's try to help you understand that in relationship to Cézanne. You can see it most easily in his still lifes. If you look at this still life, it appears as if we have some buns and what appears to be apples, maybe some peaches or whatever thrown in there. And they're all on a table. And we notice the table edge starts on the right side of the image. Try to follow that edge to the left side of the image. Notice there's a piece of fabric that they're on, and all of a sudden that viewpoint drops down. All of a sudden that edge is no longer there. Now he knew that table was a consistent shape, but he wanted to represent it as being seen from multiple viewpoints. Also, the other thing he did, if you look at the fruit, most of the fruit you see represented have black outlines. Now, if you're familiar with Impressionist painting, they're full of color. The one color you almost never see is black. Because black sort of carves an edge out of a shape and gives it a kind of solidity. And Impressionism is meant to be more of a kind of atmospheric screen of color that floats. So you notice how he creates a kind of durability, kind of solidity. Now, I've talked about the fact that the Expressionists paint quickly. Sometimes Van Gogh had several paintings lined up in a row, and he'd paint a little one, move to the next, back and forth, back and forth. Cézanne took forever to make a painting. First of all, he lived a very comfortable life. His father was a wealthy banker. He lived in southern France. As far as I know, he never had a job in his whole life. He simply was a kind of gentleman painter. He was a very unusual person. Most people had a hard time getting along with him. He's a very kind of grumpy guy. It took a long time for people to figure out, there's something about what this guy is thinking and saying and doing. Any case, the other thing he does with his viewpoints here If you look in the back there, you see a white dish, and those look to me like, well, hot dog buns, actually, what they look like, sort of stacked up. Any case, if you look at the rim of that lip, of that little bowl that they're in, it's distorted. It's not what we call a true ellipse. That shape should be called an ellipse. It represents a circle seen in space. But he distorts that. Now, he knows these rules. It's not like he can't follow them. But he distorts that because he's trying to help us get this multiple viewpoint. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. Look at the rim of that bowl as it enters behind the hot dog buns. And then look at it as it comes out on the other side. Notice it's like an inch or two higher. It's the same thing he did with the edge of the table. He's constantly shifting space around to create this idea of a moving observer. Movement is going to be fundamental to the modern world. This is a guy who starts us to understand how critical movement is to our understanding of space. Can we see the next one? This is a mountain that is in the south of France, close to where his estate was. And you can see what he does to it. He creates a kind of pictorial reality that has the mountain dominating the painting. And by the way, he did about 40, 50 paintings of this mountain. But notice again, he uses his outlines, and you can see how he breaks nature apart again, almost into facets. He said the painter should paint reality, the geometric reality of vision, cylinders and cones and spheres. So he breaks things down, even nature, into kind of geometric shapes with a lot of, again, dark edges. And you see what's really happening here. You see how close we are to abstraction? He's more interested in the space of what he's drawing here than some scenic view of this mountain. This mountain is simply a starting point for his interest in the structure of the painting he's creating. The painting becomes a world unto itself. Now, can we see the next one, please? Cubism is the style that eventually grew out of Cézanne's work. There are two artists who are most associated with the initial development of Cubism. I'm going to show you both of their work today. Georges Braque, and Pablo Picasso. Now this is a still life that Braque painted. Again, notice it's a subject matter derived from Cézanne. These guys really look to Cézanne as a kind of leader in what they were doing. And what they're trying to do is create a new sense of visual space. So notice how this painting, although you kind of see what appears to be kind of white, especially on the right edge, that might be a background, that same white becomes part of the subject matter of these objects on what appears to be probably a circular table. Yep. And so the definition between foreground and background is kind of lost here. And if you look at the table, it's a sort of circular form. If you try to follow that bottom arc and then part of an arc at the top, it obviously would create mostly a circle. Well, to see a table, mostly a circle like that, how can you see it? You have to be straight above it to see it that way. So he puts us in an odd position in space. And then what he does, that and represents a few objects we associate with a still life. You have part of a bottle represented there. The most obvious object is the pipe. There appears to be a cup or two, and what appears to be almost like a cocktail glass. But then you get this funny bit of what looks like woodwork, which is in fact a piece of imitation wallpaper. And the Cubists started to play with this idea of the painting used to be an imitation of reality. They said, well, let's start to play a mental game with that. Let's take something from reality that is an imitation of reality and put it in the painting. Now, what the heck are you looking at? Is it real? Is that a painting of that piece of stuff? No, it's not. It's a real piece of wallpaper or whatever it was that's attached to the canvas of the work. So it's part of the real world, and he breaks us out of this idea of the painting as an illusion. The painting starts to take on a complete separate life of its own, a sort of structural life of its own that has relatively little to do with optical reality. And so, and all kinds of things from the real world can enter into that world, and then it can also imitate things from the real world. So the whole environment becomes emotionally kind of confusing, and nothing seems very particularly stable. And of course, the viewpoints we get here are radical. In other words, what says, he shifted us a degree or two. So it took us a few minutes to figure out why doesn't that table edge match the other edge. Now they flip those views 80, 90 degrees, and the space becomes part of a different multi-spatial world, not like the world that you and I quite live in. Can we see the next one, please? That eventually leads us to Mondrian. Of all formalists, Mondrian probably is the most radical. He started his career off as a kind of poetic nature painter. Did beautiful, very soft, poetic landscapes. Eventually, he created what he called the style. He's a Dutch painter, so it's called the still. Anyway, this painting represents ultimately what Mondrian did. He's the absolute formalist. By absolute, I mean the painting doesn't represent to be anything other than a painting. It says no reference to everyday life whatsoever. The painting is meant to be seen strictly as a painting and living its own life with its own being. Now, he is extremely careful painter. Now, a painting like this, if you knew exactly where those edges would be and you had the right masking tape, you could paint a painting like this in an afternoon. He'd take weeks and months to make a painting like this. He had a kind of meditative viewpoint, and he was thinking of the painting as a very subtle balance between forces. He's what we call a purist. The painting should be reduced down to its most simple things. a flat surface, the primary colors, no greens or intermediate colors, just red, yellow, blue, and then pure value, black and white. So the painting is meant to be simply a careful balance between forces. Now you have, in this particular case, of course, you have this giant red unit that dominates so much of the work. And then you see these little black borders. And at first the tendency is to assume those borders just become that. They're just edges. They don't enter into the composition. But if you look at it carefully, you see there are various variations on the width of those borders. And he starts to balance that red with the horizontality of that line that cuts across the bottom part of the red. And then beneath it, you get the white. And all of a sudden, white takes on the role of a color almost. It really dominates that space in a powerful way. And of course, off to the corners, you're just getting what appears to be almost a semi-afterthought, the blue and the yellow. But the whole idea is that the painting is an object of restful contemplation. It's almost a Buddhist-like kind of idea of meditation about what art is. Absolutely as far away from Vincent van Gogh as you can possibly get. Now, after I try to create the saint-like image of Mondrian, let's look at the next slide. Broadway Boogie Woogie. He came to America. He created a painting, the painting we just saw in Europe. He came to America. And of course, he came to New York, the art center in America at that point. He came here in the 30s, by the way. And of course, he was most impressed with Broadway, with the theaters, with the neon lights. There was nothing quite like that in Europe. And you see, he's taken the same technique, but now somehow manipulated that composition. And if we didn't have this title, we'd still get the sense of these pulsating rhythms in this thing. If you're familiar with a piece of music like Flight of the Bumblebee or something like that, you get a sense of that energy and constant movement that becomes a part of what we call boogie woogie music. Again, a painting meant to be understood by itself, but in this particular case, he's making a concession to the real world he's living in. Now can we see the next one? I said I show you a painting by Picasso. Here it is. This is Guernica. Guernica is probably, of modern paintings, one of the most important of all of them. It's a huge painting. Here it's represented in feet and inches. It's 25 feet across, so it's at least as big as the front of this room. It's almost 12 feet high. So if you can imagine the whole front of this room, that's pretty much the size of Guernica. Used to be here in America. It used to be in the Modern Art Museum in New York City. He created the painting to commemorate the Nazi bombing of a small little Basque town in Spain. He was Spanish in background. And it was meant to be shown in a World's Fair in the Spanish pavilion. The rebel forces had their own pavilion at the World Fair. They commissioned Picasso to make a painting for that pavilion. So it's a giant painting meant to be seen in a kind of as a big splash dominating the space. And what he's trying to do is represent the horror of modern Nazi atrocities. They sided with, this Bosstown sided with the rebels, and Franco called his buddy Hitler. Hitler sent the German Air Force over. This was a little nothing town, and they just absolutely flattened the whole town. And this represents the horror of that moment. Most people look at this and say, where's the color? This is the color. He drained the whole image of color. One of the ideas he was trying to create here is the panic that's associated with modern aerial bombardment. And so images rush across the pictorial surface, and everything gets a kind of flickering quality. If you've ever seen when bombs explode, it looks like lightning flash. So you get this momentary bright light and then pitch black. And so that's kind of the flickering quality he creates in this image. He's trying to take Cubism, which is this systematic, mathematical, thoughtful way of painting, and use that means for expressionism. So this painting has got as much expressionistic energy as any paintings we've seen so far. There are all kinds of complicated symbols here. Remember, he's a Spaniard, and he represents the bull in the upper section there. You miss part of its body because of the value of this slide. That swirling shape you see coming up is the bull's tail, so you're missing part of its body. But in any case, the bull is the most stable, static figure in the whole painting. And then beneath it is this awful image of this mother holding her dead baby and screaming. You've got, on the ground level, you see broken parts of what appeared to be a statue. You have a head and part of an arm going this way. If you look that way, you see another arm with a broken sword. That represents a kind of fallen warriors, that the town has no warriors to fight back with. The horse in the middle becomes kind of nature's kind of being wounded by this awful event. And so the horse has a spear through it. You see a figure coming in the upper left or the right-hand corner with a lantern down from what appears to be an upstairs room or something. And in kind of panic, the figure to the far right is probably in a burning building and looks like it's screaming for help. It's just a horrific, awful painting. But if you think modern art can't communicate, I think you have to look at a work like this and say, wait a minute here. This is not meaningless stuff. Picasso was a guy who painted very quickly, like Van Gogh, because he tended more in a more expressionist direction. He took a long, long time with his painting, doing all kinds of studies of individual parts of it and so on. And by the way, eventually, the painting left America. Once Franco died, once Spain became free, he said, I want the painting to go back to Spain. But it doesn't belong there with that kind of leadership. But once it becomes free, I want the painting to go back to Spain. And so the painting is now I think it's in the Prado in Spain. Now, can we see the next one? Remember, the whole idea of Cubism is movement, but the idea of a moving observer. So the observer sees the object from several different viewpoints, and you get this fractured, fragmented quality. Last time I finished my lecture with a work by Rodin, the thinker, which was a kind of monument, really, of 19th century sculpture. One of the most important sculptures of the earliest 20th century was this piece by Boccioni. Boccioni was what we call a futurist. Yeah. A futurist is absolutely the opposite of a cubist. The cubist is talking about a moving observer and a fixed object. A futurist is talking about a fixed observer and a moving object. At this point, Muybridge had done his photographs studying motion of the human figure, and Boccioni created this idea of a kind of some sort of a dynamic, forceful figure sort of striding forward with a tremendous amount of energy. But you see how the body is sort of flayed with these muscle shapes sort of floating all over the surface of the object. And it creates an incredible kind of dynamism. The thing just marches forward. It's not actually all that tall. It's 3'7" high. But it's just tremendously powerful piece. And by the way, I don't know how this image got this dark. The piece in the cast I've seen, I saw it in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, is bright brass color. And I think it works better in that bright color because you can't, what happens, it gets all these reflections and there's no fixed surface your eye can rest on. So that constant movement of your eye kind of gives you a sense of the action of the form thrusting through space. And the title, of course, you see, sounds like almost a scientific treatise, Unique Forms of Continuity in Space. It's sort of almost like a scientific analysis of movement, and yet the effect you get isn't a calm, quiet, scientific effect. It's incredibly powerful, as I say, especially because the sculpture really isn't all that big. Now, I've taken a little longer today than I normally do because of the complexity of some of the work today. But we have about 5 minutes, and I'd like to respond to any questions you might have. Any questions at all? Yes?
This is, I guess, like a request. The sculpture that you did of the Jacob painting, is there any way we can see it in the future lectures on this week?
What sculpture are you referring to?
You said you made a sculpture of the Jacob wrestling.
Oh, yes. No, I just did the angel itself.
Oh, you just did
Well, I hesitate to have any of my own work in this because I don't want to imply that I'm as important as any of the artists I'll be showing you. But I have to admit, my ego did get a little crack in that door. The final lecture, I'm going to show you one of my commission pieces that's at the entrance of a hospital. And it's a giant pair of wings, about 25 feet across. But that's all I'm going to be able to show you. I can't turn these lectures into self-advertisement because I'm not really an important part of this history. I'm a very peripheral guy associated with this stuff. Yes?
On the Gauguin, the Vision After the Sermon, that it's very flat,
Yes.
and the drawing is almost childlike. And how did that get this? How did somebody decide this is great art? Seriously, that and the Cubist one, I don't understand how that got to be.
You're asking, Linda, one of the very hardest questions anyone could try to answer. How do you determine quality in art?
Right.
What I can tell you how it's done, but I'm not going to imply I'm giving you a formula for doing it exactly. Basically, the people who make judgments about whether work is great or not spent their entire lifetime looking at art. And so they have a huge catalog in the back of their brains of what kind of art is being produced during a certain period. And in that catalog, some things sort of jump out, even though it doesn't seem to make a lot of cognitive sense. Why does that image stand out more than all those other images back there? And it's because of that quality that I talked about earlier that becomes a modern theme, creativity. You can't make a judgment of what's creative until you know the whole field of objects that you're making judgments about. Because being creative somehow in some way means it's going to differentiate itself from the things around it. Until you have that vision, you really can't make that judgment. Most of us think Rembrandt's great because we're told that Rembrandt's great. I can show you all kinds of artists that you think are as good or better than Rembrandt. But those who've seen art from the Baroque era see there's a way Rembrandt's work distinguishes itself from everyone else somehow without seeming to be not a part of that particular period. That's about the only way I can answer that. I think the average layman is concerned, as you just said, that image has kind of flatness to it, and therefore it doesn't look like it's very professionally done. The average layman is concerned that they're being cheated. Why am I supposed to like this? I'm going to stand for myself, and even though you tell me Cézanne's great, I still don't care about Cézanne. It's okay to make your own judgments, but the average person feels like I'm being cheated. This stuff is being thrown at me, and these people are a bunch of idiots. They're a bunch of intellectuals who don't have any contact with the real world. I've lived my entire life in the art world. I lived my entire life, professional life, among intellectuals. And it is what it is. I'm not justifying it. I'm simply saying there it is. And yes.
To compare it, I'm looking at what Mandarin painted with his red, blue, and yellow squares, if you want to call it that.
Mm-hmm.
Who would have come up to that and said, I've got to have that. It's so good. It's
Exactly.
what I'm used to.
Mm-hmm. I'm really not sure about the sales record of Mondrian's work. A lot of this stuff gets recognized later on. In fact, you just simply have to have a context in which to evaluate it to realize how unique it is. So often the value gets established long after the work is shown, and then it starts to rise in value. And of course, the values nowadays, given the affluence of the Arab world and so on, paintings go for $50–60 million nowadays. Paintings that were done in 2 and 3 hours. Basquiat, who is a young black man who painted in New York City in the basement of a gallery and did a painting every day practically, painted 8 hours a day, every day he did a painting. Those paintings are selling for millions of dollars now. Now, I'm not going to be able to justify that or fully explain it. I'm simply saying that's a phenomenon. I've looked at his paintings. They are awfully good paintings. They stand out in a way that highlights them in my mind, certainly. Yes?
In response to the question, I know of people who have a space in their home, and they've got draperies and carpeting and furniture, and they've got a wall with nothing on it. And oh my goodness, those colors just bust. And they're not looking at it as a thing, they're looking at it as a group of colors that fill space on the wall, kind of round out the room. I think sometimes you can buy it not because you like it as art, you like it as clothes.
Mm-hmm.
So it's with the cat.
Well, in a strange way, you see how that moves a complete circle, because the artist thought of it as color, but typically there's also a deeper intellectual history behind that superficial sort of designation of bright colors. And until you live in that intellectual history, as I do, I read about this stuff, I think about it, being an artist myself, it doesn't make a lot of sense to most people. It looks like a wasted life, but thinking is fun. if you're the kind of personality that enjoys it, but not everyone does. That's okay.
Our city,
Yes.
I was going to say, when I saw that this was such a square picture, and it was done in 1930, that was about the time when photography became very, very nice and neat, and everybody had a camera.
Mm-hmm.
So they could take pictures of stuff, but they couldn't exactly, I don't want to say draw something like he did.
See, you're thinking about this idea of replication, that somehow, if I could replicate this, all of a sudden, how could this be worth $50 million if I could do this? Again, the idea of creativity, you start with the idea, what's the first object? There are all kinds of technological things that we all rely on and seem to understand. Some genius at some point came up with that concept. And it's right as human beings to value and honor those people who represent the highlights of what it means to be human. That's ultimately, if you're looking for a theme behind these lectures, that's what we're talking about. These are representations of what it means to be human, living in a certain place and a certain time. It should help us understand what it felt like to be a part of that world. And the problem we have today, and we're going to get to this in our 5th lecture, is we live in such a complex, fragmented time. It's hard for us to know where we live, other than through confusion. What the hell's going on? Well, you'll get that. You're going to ask that question at the end of my last lecture. It's called A Wider View. And I'm just trying to open you up to that quality of being open to things you don't understand. Yeah.
How do the laws regarding intellectual property operate in the for example, is this piece protested and for how long and how does that go?
I'm not sure I heard everything you asked me.
He's asking about copyright.
Could somebody make an exact replica of that and sell it under their name, or is that protected by copyright or some other intellectual?
Well, it's in our world. It's called provenance. It's a history of the object, ownership history, and that's one of the ways we guard against fakery and so on. For instance, in one of the next lectures, we're going to look at the work of Jackson Pollock. One of the great galleries in New York, one of the owners of the gallery had what she thought was a Pollock painting in her office, and she had been selling paintings she thought were Pollock paintings, and to major figures for millions of dollars. One of the reasons that that gallery is now closed and she's no longer in the business, the artist's signature was misspelled. His name was Jackson Pollock, and the Chinese-American artist who made the painting, and by the way, it's a good painting, it had the one L in Pollock, and I think there are two L's in Pollock. Folks, it's beyond our time. It's time for us to eat. I'll see you next week, and we'll get a chance to look at more complex art. Thank you for coming.